The air inside the prison transport was stifling, thick with the metallic tang of fear. Liora Vega sat quietly among the other captives, her hands bound in smooth, unyielding restraints. The hum of the transport's engines was a constant reminder of their captivity, a low, mournful drone that seemed to press against her chest. Around her, the faces of her comrades bore varying shades of despair, some blank with shock, others pale and drawn, their gazes fixed on the floor. The Tyrannac guards were a stark contrast, their rigid postures and sharp armor glinting under the harsh lights. Their reptilian eyes swept over the prisoners with detached efficiency, as though cataloging cattle rather than living, breathing beings. One of them barked something in a guttural tongue, and a younger guard near the back chuckled. Liora could feel the tension in the room tightens like a wire about to snap. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm under pressure, to see the cracks in even the most impossible situations. But this felt like a wall without seams. The transport jolted violently as it docked with the orbiting prison station, and the harsh voice of the ship's intercom crackled to life. Prepare for prisoner intake. Protocol Sigma 12 is in effect. Non-compliance will result in immediate termination. The words were delivered with cold finality, as though spoken by the void itself. The guards herded them into formation with the efficiency of machines. One stumbled, an older man with a limp, and was impacted. The man fell with a grunt, and a hiss of laughter rippled among the guards. Liora clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. The sight filled her with fury, but her face betrayed nothing. She stepped forward, crouching slightly to help the man up. "Keep moving," one of the guards growled, his baton raised. Liora stood, meeting his gaze with a calm that felt both reckless and unshakable. "He's moving," she said simply, her voice smooth and steady. The guard stared at her for a moment, his slit pupil eyes narrowing, but he didn't strike. Instead, he gestured sharply for her to fall back in line. As they shuffled forward, Liora caught sight of the station's interior through the docking bay's windows. The prison was enormous, a sprawling monolith of metal and shadow suspended in the infinite black of space. Lights blinked in rhythmic patterns along its hull, like a heartbeat. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, not just its size, but what it represented: total control. A machine designed to break not just bodies, but souls. They were processed in silence. Names, designations, irrelevant details were stripped away. They were no longer soldiers, engineers, or pilots, just prisoners, numbers in a system. It wasn't until she was led to her cell that the reality of her situation hit her fully. The room was small, the walls cold and unforgiving. A faint hum emanated from somewhere, just low enough to gnaw at the edges of her mind. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, flickering in ways that didn't make sense. It was a room designed to take away whatever hope its occupant might cling to. The door hissed shut behind her, and she was alone. Liora sat on the metal bench bolted to the wall, letting her eyes scan the room. She noted the hidden cameras, the subtle vents designed to manipulate the air, the way the light was calibrated to flicker at unsettling intervals. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. She let out a slow, deliberate breath, leaning back against the wall. "Well," she said aloud to the empty room, her voice tinged with wry amusement, "this place could really use a decorator." Somewhere, through one of those hidden cameras, a guard must have been watching. Maybe they expected her to tremble, to cry. Instead, she smiled, a small, sharp smile that hinted at something unbroken. Liora wasn't here to survive. She was here to change the rules of the game, and she had already started. The days blurred together in a monotonous grind of silence and control. The guards moved like clockwork, their boots striking the metal floors in perfect unison. The prisoners shuffled from cell to cell, their heads down, their spirits weighed by the unrelenting hum of the station. Liora, however, had not surrendered to the rhythm. She watched, she listened, and she waited. It was on the 5th day, during the mandatory exercise period, that the first spark of her plan ignited. The prisoners were herded into a cavernous room lined with observation windows. The guards loomed above, their weapons at the ready, but their boredom was palpable. The exercise was meant to exhaust and pacify, not rejuvenate. Liora stood near the edge of the group, her eyes scanning the room. Beside her, Kai Soren leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He had been a fighter pilot, one of Earth's best, but now he looked like a shadow of himself. "Think they'll ever give us a treadmill?" she murmured, her voice just loud enough to reach him. Kai didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing as if considering whether to engage. Finally, he muttered, "You planning to jog your way out of here?" Liora smirked. "Might work, they seem like the type to appreciate cardio." The corner of Kai's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Liora. She turned back to the room, her voice rising slightly. "You know what this place reminds me of? Those theme park rides where they try too hard to scare you. All they're missing is the creepy animatronics." One of the prisoners nearby, a wiry woman with a shock of silver hair, chuckled softly. The sound was quickly smothered by the oppressive atmosphere, but it was there. A crack in the wall. Liora pressed on. "Maybe we should start a petition. Dear evil overlords, please consider adding a karaoke machine. It'll really boost morale." This time, a few more prisoners glanced her way, their expressions hesitant but curious. Even Kai seemed intrigued, though he masked it behind a scowl. "You should stop," he muttered under his breath. "They'll notice." "They already have," Liora replied, her tone calm. "Might as well make it worth their while." She took a step forward, her voice carrying now, cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. "Come on, we're stuck here anyway, might as well entertain ourselves. Who's got a joke?" For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the station. Then, a voice from the back, dry and raspy but defiant. "What do you call a tyrannac who's bad at his job?" The group turned, a ripple of disbelief and anticipation spreading through them. The man, an older prisoner with a lined face, grinned, unemployed. The laughter started small, hesitant, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Then it grew, rolling through the room in waves. Even the guards above seemed momentarily frozen, their rigid postures faltering as they glanced at one another in confusion. Kai looked at Liora, his frown deepening. "You're going to get us all in trouble." "Maybe," she said, her eyes alight with a mix of mischief and determination. "But look around, Kai, they're laughing. When was the last time anyone in this place laughed?" He didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. Liora stepped back into the group, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "Fear only works if we let it. If we're not afraid, they lose. It's that simple." Kai stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't agreement, not yet, but it was a start. Above them, one of the guards slammed his baton against the railing, shouting for silence. The laughter subsided, but it didn't disappear. It lingered in the air, a quiet rebellion, and for the first time since her capture, Liora felt something shift. The game had begun. The game had begun, but the strain quickly became clear. The laughter that had rippled through the exercise room had not gone unnoticed. Later that night, as the prisoners were herded back to their cells, Liora felt the shift in the guards' demeanor. Their movements were sharper, their eyes more alert. The station seemed colder, the shadows deeper, as though the prison itself disapproved of the spark she had lit. By the next morning, the retaliation had begun. The lights in their cells were kept on at full brightness, searing into their eyes and depriving them of rest. The meals, already flavorless and meager, were reduced to a thin, gray paste that left them weak, and the guards, once content to glare silently, now prowled the corridors, delivering thinly veiled and watching every movement with suspicion. Liora expected this. What she didn't expect was the doubt creeping into her own mind, as she sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the bare walls of her cell. The weight of her actions began to press against her chest. Had she been reckless? Had she put everyone in greater danger for the sake of a joke? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint knock against the wall beside her. She turned, frowning. The walls were thick, soundproofed to isolate prisoners from one another. But somehow, a rhythm was emerging. Tap, 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 tap. It was deliberate, intentional. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening intently. The tapping repeated itself, forming a pattern. It took her a moment to recognize it, Morse code. She hadn't used it in years, but the rhythm was unmistakable. "You okay?" it asked. Liora's lips twitched into a smile despite herself. She tapped back, her fingers trembling slightly against the cold metal. "I've been better. You?" The reply came swiftly. "Better than them." She laughed softly, her breath misting in the cool air. Whoever it was, they weren't giving up, and neither would she. The next time the guards dragged her out of her cell for mandatory inspections, she met their stares with calm defiance. She walked taller, smiled more, and whispered words of encouragement to the prisoners she passed. The guards noticed. Of course, One of them, a towering brute with deep-set eyes, cornered her after an inspection, slamming her against the wall. "You think this is a game?" he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you're clever?" She didn't flinch. "Clever enough to get under your skin, apparently," she replied, her voice steady. His grip tightened, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Back off." It was Kai. He stood a few paces away, his arms crossed and his expression hard as stone. The guard hesitated, his gaze flicking between them, before finally shoving Liora aside and stalking off with a muttered curse. Liora straightened, brushing off her jumpsuit. "Took you long enough?" Kai's brow furrowed. "You're going to push them too far." "That's the point," she said, meeting his gaze. "If they're focused on me, they're not focused on the rest of you. You can't take this on alone," he said, his voice low but firm. "Whatever you're planning, you're going to need help." It was the closest thing to an offer of alliance she'd heard from him, and she wasn't about to waste it. "Then help me," she said simply. He didn't respond immediately, but the silence between them was charged with understanding. Finally, he nodded. "What's the plan?" The plan unfolded over the next several days, a delicate balance of subtlety and audacity. Liora began organizing secret gatherings during exercise periods, teaching the prisoners to communicate in ways the guards couldn't detect. Kai, with his tactical mind and sharp instincts, helped identify weaknesses in the station's routines. Together, they laid the groundwork for something bigger than themselves, a movement. The guards fought back with increasing severity. One day, the exercise period was replaced with forced isolation. Another day, the air in the cells grew thin, leaving them gasping for breath. But no matter how hard the guards pushed, Liora and Kai pushed back harder. They used the isolation to refine their plans, turning the guards' attempts at suppression into opportunities for connection. Then came the turning point. During a routine inspection, a guard accidentally left a maintenance panel ajar. Liora noticed it immediately, her sharp eyes catching the faint glint of exposed wires. She didn't hesitate. Pretending to stumble, she pressed against the panel, slipping a thin piece of metal from her sleeve into the exposed mechanism. It was a gamble, but if it worked, the lights in the corridor flickered, and for a brief, glorious moment, the surveillance cameras powered down. It wasn't long enough to escape, but it was long enough to send a message. Using the stolen moment, Liora scratched a single word into the wall of her cell: hope. When the cameras flickered back on, the guards found nothing amiss, at least, nothing they could trace back to her. But the message spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, the word had appeared in every cell block, scrawled in scratches and smears. Hope. It was more than a word, it was a promise, and it was only the beginning. The word hope spread like a spark in dry grass. Prisoners who had once shuffled in silence now walked with their heads slightly higher, their gazes no longer fixed on the floor. The guards noticed the change, and so did Commander Zarek. From his vantage point in the control room, he watched as the shift rippled through the station like a virus. His claws tapped against the console as he studied the security feeds, his reptilian eyes narrowing. Something was happening, and it was centered on that human woman. "Bring her to me," Zarek ordered, his voice cold and sharp. The guards moved swiftly, dragging Liora from her cell and into the sterile, oppressive chamber that served as his interrogation room. She was pushed into a metal chair under a harsh spotlight. Zarek loomed over her, his scaled face inches from hers. "You've been busy," he said, his voice a low growl. "Do you think I don't see what you're doing? Do you think I don't understand?" Liora looked up at him, her face calm but her eyes alight with defiance. "You might see it," she said, her voice steady, "but you don't understand. That's your problem." Zarek's clawed hand slammed onto the table beside her, the sound reverberating through the chamber. "You think your games matter? You're a prisoner, you have no power here. And yet you brought me here," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "Seems like I'm more powerful than you'd like to admit." His lips curled into a snarl, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might strike her, but then he laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You think your little tricks can break this station? You're nothing, a speck, a joke." "Maybe," she said, leaning forward now, her gaze piercing, "but do you know what's stronger than fear, Commander? What's stronger than all the walls and weapons you can throw at us?" She didn't wait for his answer. "It's hope, and it's spreading. You can't stop it, no matter how hard you try." Zarek's eyes burned with fury, but before he could respond, an alarm blared through the station. The lights flickered, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Commander, there's a disturbance in Block C. Multiple guards are down. We need reinforcements." Leora's lips twitched into a smile. "Looks like my tricks are working after all." Zarek snarled and barked orders into his communicator. The guards who had been stationed outside the chamber rushed away, leaving Liora alone with the commander. He turned back to her, his expression a mask of fury. "What have you done?" "I didn't do anything," she said lightly. "This isn't about me, it's about them." Before Zarek could respond, the chamber door burst open, and Kai stepped inside, his expression fierce. He held a confiscated stun baton in one hand and a stolen access key in the other. "Time to go," he said, his voice clipped but steady. Liora stood, her restraints falling away as Kai tossed her the key. "What took you so long?" she asked, her tone teasing despite the chaos. Kai smirked, had to make sure the guards were busy. Behind him, the sounds of the uprising echoed through the station, shouts, alarms, and the unmistakable hum of sabotage. The prisoners had risen, using every crack in the system that Liora and Kai had uncovered. The guards were overwhelmed, their carefully maintained control unraveling by the second. As they moved through the station, Liora and Kai encountered groups of prisoners rallying together, their faces alight with determination. Some carried makeshift weapons, others simply carried the strength of their numbers. Everywhere they went, the word hope was scrawled on walls, floors, and even uniforms. The turning point came in the central control hub, where a group of prisoners had managed to breach the security systems. Zarek, realizing his station was slipping from his grasp, had retreated there, his claws flying over the controls in a desperate attempt to restore order. Liora and Kai burst into the room, flanked by a dozen prisoners. Zarek whirled to face them, his eyes wild. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This station is still mine. I can destroy it all with a single command." "Go ahead," Liora said, stepping forward. "Destroy it. Prove to everyone here that your only power is fear." Or, she paused, her voice softening, "you can surrender. You can let this end without more ado." Zarek hesitated, his claw hovering over the control panel. The room was silent except for the distant echoes of the rebellion. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Why? Why do you fight like this? You're just humans, weak, insignificant." Liora met his gaze, her own steady and unyielding. "Because we don't need to be strong to win, we just need to believe. And right now, Commander, everyone in this station believes in something bigger than you." The prisoners around her cheered, their voices rising in a triumphant roar. Zarek's hand fell away from the controls, and for the first time, the mighty commander of Eclipse 13 looked defeated. Liora stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "It's over, Zarek, you've lost." And with that, the station fell, not to weapons or force, but to the unshakable power of hope and the courage of those who refused to give in. The station fell silent in the aftermath, save for the distant hum of its systems and the occasional crackle of damaged machinery. The chaos had subsided, leaving a strange, fragile calm in its wake. Prisoners and former guards alike stood together in uneasy alliance, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. The once imposing prison had transformed into something unrecognizable, a place no longer ruled by fear, but by the courage of those who had dared to defy it. Liora stood at the center of the control hub, her eyes scanning the room. The word hope was etched into the walls and floors, a testament to the revolution they had sparked. Zarek sat slumped in the corner, his shoulders bowed, the weight of his defeat pressing him into silence. He looked smaller now, stripped of his authority and the power he had wielded so mercilessly. Kai approached her, his steps measured and his expression unreadable. He stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms as he looked her over. "Well," he said, his voice dry, "you did it." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her lips curving into a faint smile. "We did it." He shook his head. "No, Liora, you did this. They followed you because you gave them something to believe in." Her smile faltered, and she turned her gaze to the others in the room. They were all watching her now, prisoners who had once shuffled in silence, guards who had once enforced tyranny, all united by the same flicker of hope that had started with her. The weight of it was overwhelming, but she didn't shy away. Stepping forward, she raised her voice, letting it carry through the room. "This isn't just a victory for us," she said. "It's a message to everyone out there who's been crushed by fear, who's been told they're powerless. You're not. We're not. Together, we're unstoppable." The room erupted into cheers. A sound so powerful it seemed to reverberate through the very walls. Liora felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, keeping her composure. This wasn't the time to falter. As the noise subsided, Kai leaned in, his voice low. You realize this isn't over, right? The Tyrannac won't let this slide. I know, she said, her tone steady, but this is just the beginning. They worked quickly, using the station's communication systems to broadcast a message across the galaxy. Liora stood in front of the camera, her posture straight, her voice clear and unwavering. To anyone listening, we are free, and we're fighting for everyone who can't fight for themselves. If you're out there, if you're trapped, if you're afraid, know this, you're not alone. Hope is stronger than fear, and we're coming for you. The transmission ended, and for a moment, the room was silent again. Then, slowly, the prisoners began to move, their movements purposeful and determined. They dismantled the remaining weapons, repaired damaged systems, and began organizing for the next phase of their journey. The station was no longer a prison, it was a symbol of resistance. As the last of the preparations were completed, Liora stood by one of the observation windows, gazing out at the endless expanse of stars. Kai joined her, his hands in his pockets and his expression thoughtful. You really believe we can win this? He asked quietly. She turned to him, her eyes bright with determination. I believe we already have. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. What now? She looked back at the stars, her voice soft but resolute. Now, we show the galaxy what it means to be human. And as the station powered up for its first flight as a vessel of freedom, Liora Vega stood at the helm, ready to lead not just her people, but an entire galaxy, into a future shaped by courage, unity, and hope.